In the frostbitten dawn of the 4th of November, 1791, 1,700 American soldiers awoke to a nightmare along the Wabash River. A crescent of 1,400 native warriors, muskets gleaming with British steel, charging from the shadows. By noon, over 800 Americans lay dead or wounded, their dreams of conquest shattered in a 3-hour slaughter that dwarfed Custer's last stand. Why did the fledgling U.S. Army, led by a Revolutionary War hero, suffer its greatest defeat at the hands of a native coalition? Stay with us to uncover the missteps, betrayals, and brilliance that define this pivotal clash. The American Revolution drew to a close in 1783, yet the Northwest Territory, a sprawling region encompassing modern Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and parts of Minnesota, remained a crucible of conflict. Far from the celebrated Peace of Yorktown, this frontier seethed with unrest. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, had promised boundaries and mutual respect between the United States and native nations, but its ink barely dried before American settlers surged westward. By 1785, over 10,000 settlers had crossed the Ohio River, claiming lands guaranteed to native tribes. These encroachments, often backed by local militias, sparked skirmishes that left dozens of native villages burned and settler cabins reduced to ash. Historian Colin G. Calloway notes in The Victory with No Name that these violations set the stage for a decade of warfare as trust eroded on both sides. British agents, lingering in forts like Detroit despite the Treaty of Paris, fanned the flames. Defiant of their obligation to withdraw, they supplied native tribes with muskets, powder, and steel hatchets. In 1789 alone, British traders at Detroit distributed over 1,500 pounds of gunpowder to Shawnee and Miami warriors, according to fur trade records cited by John F. Winkler in Wabash, 1791. This covert support emboldened native resistance, transforming local raids into a coordinated defense. The British, still smarting from their revolutionary defeat, saw native strength as a check against American expansion. Their actions, a historian might argue with a tinge of irony, turned the Northwest Territory into a proxy battlefield, where old imperial grudges found new expression. The United States, barely 2 years into its constitutional era in 1789, grappled with its own fragility. The federal government, headquartered in Philadelphia, lacked the funds and standing army to police the frontier. With a national debt exceeding $50 million, as reported in Treasury records, the U.S. could muster only 700 regular troops nationwide. This weakness emboldened native resistance and exposed settlers to retaliatory raids. President George Washington, a surveyor by training, viewed the Northwest Territory as vital to the nation's future. Yet, as historian Gregory Dowd observes in A Spirited Resistance, Washington's vision of orderly expansion clashed with the chaotic reality of a frontier where neither law nor diplomacy held sway. Native tribes, including the Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, Wyandot, and Mingo, forged a formidable confederation by 1790. United by leaders like Miami Chief Little Turtle and Shawnee warrior Blue Jacket, they numbered over 3,000 warriors across dozens of villages. Their goal was not conquest but survival, defending lands their ancestors had hunted and farmed for centuries. The Confederation's strength lay in its unity, a rare alignment of tribes with distinct languages and traditions. By 1790, their raids had destroyed over 200 settler homes in Ohio alone, per militia reports, signaling their resolve to halt American encroachment. Violence spiraled as the decade progressed. By 1790, the cycle of raids and counter-raids had claimed over 500 lives on both sides, according to frontier dispatches. Settlers, often poorly armed, faced ambushes that left families slaughtered in their cabins. Native villages, in turn, endured punitive expeditions by American militias who burned crops and homes. This tit-for-tat warfare, grim and unrelenting, poisoned any hope of negotiation. A historian might pause here, with a note of solemnity, to reflect on the human cost. Entire communities, native and settler alike, lived in dread of the next dawn. George Washington, under mounting pressure, faced a stark choice. The frontier's chaos threatened not only settlers, but the young republic's credibility. Congress, dominated by expansionist voices, demanded action to secure the Northwest Territory. By 1790, petitions from Ohio settlers, numbering over 1,000 signatures, flooded Philadelphia, pleading for military protection. Washington, wary of overextending the nation's meager resources, nonetheless ordered a campaign to subdue the native Confederation. His decision, as historian Richard Cohn argues in Eagle and Sword, reflected a belief that only force could clear the path for American destiny. The Battle of the Wabash, fought on the 4th of November, 1791, looms as a pivotal moment in this turbulent saga. Often eclipsed by the more famous Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, where 268 U.S. soldiers perished, the Wabash was far bloodier. Over 800 American soldiers, militiamen, and civilians would fall in a single morning, a toll that stunned the nation. Unlike Little Bighorn, which came during an established Indian Wars era, the Wabash struck a fledgling U.S. army still finding its footing. Historian John Grenier, in The First Way of War, calls it a catastrophe that exposed the Republic's military infancy, a grim testament to the challenges of frontier warfare. This clash, though lesser known, was no mere skirmish. It pitted a native confederation, armed with British muskets and centuries of tactical wisdom, against a U.S. force crippled by hubris and mismanagement. The stakes were immense. For the United States, control of the Northwest Territory. For the native tribes, the survival of their way of life. As the events of 1791 unfolded, the Wabash would reveal with brutal clarity the cost of ambition and the resilience of those who stood their ground. In the summer of 1790, President George Washington, his patience worn thin by relentless native raids, turned his gaze to the Northwest Territory. He tasked Brigadier General Josiah Harmar, a seasoned officer of the Revolution, with crushing the Miami tribe's resistance. The Miami, led by the astute Chief Little Turtle, had struck settler outposts with precision, burning over 150 cabins in Ohio alone that year, according to frontier militia logs. Washington's orders were clear. March to the Miami stronghold of Kekianga, near present-day Fort Wayne, Indiana, and deliver a decisive blow. Harmar, with 1,400 men under his command, set out in September, his mission carrying the weight of a young nation's ambitions. Yet, as historian John F. Winkler notes in Wabash 1791, Harmar's campaign was doomed by overconfidence and under-preparation, a prelude to greater disasters. Harmar's force, a mix of 320 regular soldiers and 1,100 militia, was formidable on paper but riddled with flaws. Supply shortages crippled the expedition from the start. By October, his troops marched with only 10 days' worth of rations, per Harmar's own reports, and their muskets, many dating back to the Revolution, misfired in damp conditions. The militia, drawn from frontier settlements, lacked discipline, with over 200 desertions recorded before reaching Kekiunga. Harmar, a Philadelphia aristocrat, underestimated the Miami's resolve, assuming his numbers would overwhelm what he dismissed as savage resistance. This arrogance, historian Gregory Dowd argues in A Spirited Resistance, blinded him to the terrain and the enemy's tactical edge. As Harmar approached Kekiunga in mid-October 1790, Little Turtle struck. His force of 600 Miami and Shawnee warriors, nimble and intimately familiar with the dense forests, employed guerrilla tactics honed over generations. On the 19th of October, near the Maumee River, they ambushed a detachment of 300 men led by Colonel John Hardin. Hiding behind trees and riverbanks, The warriors fired volleys that killed 129 soldiers in minutes, per surviving officers' accounts. The militia panicked, fleeing as Little Turtle's men melted back into the woods. 2 days later, another skirmish claimed 50 more American lives. Harmar, shaken, ordered his men to burn Kekionga's abandoned huts, a hollow gesture that masked his failure to engage the enemy. By the 22nd of October, Harmar's campaign collapsed. His losses totaled 183 killed and 31 wounded, a devastating toll for a force meant to project strength. Retreating to Fort Washington in Cincinnati, he left behind a trail of discarded supplies, over 1,000 pounds of flour and 200 muskets, per quartermaster records. The retreat was a disgrace, with militia straggling back in rags, their morale shattered. Harmar's defeat, as historian Colin G. Calloway writes in The Victory with No Name, revealed the U.S. Army's inability to adapt to frontier warfare, exposing a reliance on European-style tactics ill-suited to the wilderness. Congress, convened in Philadelphia, erupted in fury. The defeat at Kekionga was not just a military setback but a national humiliation. In December 1790, over 30 congressmen, led by Virginia's John Page, penned a resolution demanding immediate measures to restore American honor, per congressional records. The loss of 183 men, nearly a quarter of the nation's regular army, stung a country already strapped by a $50 million debt. With a sardonic edge, one might note that Congress, quick to clamor for revenge, had allocated only $100,000 for the entire campaign, a sum barely sufficient for wages, let alone provisions. Harmar's failure sent ripples through the frontier. The native Confederation, now emboldened, intensified their raids. In the winter of 1790, Shawnee and Miami warriors struck 47 settler outposts in Ohio, killing 89 civilians, according to Territorial Governor Arthur St. Clair's dispatches. Villages like Dunlap Station endured sieges, their wooden palisades splintered by musket fire. The Confederation's success, historian Richard White argues in The Middle Ground, galvanized tribes across the Northwest Territory, proving that unity could defy American might. Little Turtle, once a regional leader, emerged as a symbol of resistance, his name whispered with dread in settler cabins. The U.S. Army's weaknesses lay bare. Poor planning had left Harmar's men starving, with only 8 ounces of bread per soldier daily by campaign's end, per supply logs. The supply chain, managed by distant Philadelphia quartermasters, failed to deliver blankets or boots, leaving 400 men frostbitten. This logistical collapse, as historian John Grenier notes in The First Way of War, reflected a deeper flaw. The Army's reliance on militia, who lacked the training to face disciplined native warriors. Harmar's defeat forced a reckoning, exposing the need for a professionalized force. Washington, his reputation tied to the frontier's fate, sought a new commander to salvage the nation's pride. Harmar, disgraced, resigned in early 1791, his career a casualty of the debacle. The president's gaze turned to a new leader, one who could face Little Turtle's Confederation and redeem the Army's honor. As the year turned, the stage was set for a larger, more fateful campaign, one that would plunge the Northwest Territory into a maelstrom of blood and fire. The echoes of Harmar's humiliation, grim and unyielding, would haunt the next expedition, a warning unheeded by those who marched toward the Wabash. In the wake of Josiah Harmar's humiliating defeat, President George Washington turned to a trusted comrade from the Revolution to restore order in the Northwest Territory. Arthur St. Clair, a Scottish-born general, was appointed in March 1791 to lead a new expedition against the native Confederation. At 53, St. Clair carried the scars of a long career, having fought in the French and Indian War and served with distinction at Trenton and Yorktown. His record included commanding 2,000 troops at the Battle of Princeton in 1777, where his tactical acumen helped secure a pivotal American victory, per military dispatches. Yet, As historian John F. Winkler notes in Wabash 1791, St. Clair's selection was a gamble on experience over vigor, a decision that would haunt the campaign. Washington, trusting in their shared history, believed St. Clair could subdue the Miami and Shawnee with the same resolve he showed against the British. St. Clair's health, however, cast a long shadow over his command. At 53, he suffered from severe gout, a debilitating condition that inflamed his joints and confined him to bed for days at a time. By 1791, he required aides to help him mount his horse, and his personal journals, cited in The Victory with No Name by Colin G. Calloway, reveal he endured excruciating pain during marches. This frailty alarmed his subordinates, with Major Ebenezer Denny noting in his diary that St. Clair struggled to walk 100 yards without pausing. A historian might observe, with a touch of irony, that the man chosen to lead a grueling campaign through the wilderness could barely navigate his own camp. Despite these concerns, Washington prioritized loyalty over fitness, a choice that would prove costly. Another general, Anthony Wayne, stood as a stark contrast. At 46, Wayne was vigorous, battle-hardened, and renowned for his daring assault at Stony Point in 1779, where he led 200 men to capture a British fort with only 15 losses, per Revolutionary War records. Known as Mad Anthony for his bold tactics, Wayne had experience fighting native warriors during the Revolution, routing Cherokee raiders in Georgia with a force of 300 in 1782. His popularity among troops, noted by historian Richard Cohn in Eagle and Sword, stemmed from his hands-on leadership and meticulous planning. Yet, Washington, perhaps wary of Wayne's impetuous reputation, passed him over, a decision historian Gregory Dowd calls a baffling misstep, given Wayne's later success against the same native confederation. St. Clair's revolutionary credentials, however, were undeniable. He had crossed the Delaware with Washington in 1776, enduring the icy march to Trenton where 900 Hessian prisoners were taken, according to Army rolls. By 1783, he had risen to Major General, commanding 5,000 troops across multiple campaigns. These exploits, detailed in The First Way of War by John Grenier, gave Congress confidence that St. Clair could deliver a decisive victory. His appointment was formalized on the 4th of March, 1791, with a mandate to raise 2,000 men and march to Kikionga by summer. The nation, still reeling from Harmar's 183 dead, pinned its hopes on St. Clair to crush the native resistance and open the Northwest Territory to settlement. Congress, eager to redeem the nation's honor, allocated $300,000 for the campaign, a significant sum given the Treasury's $50 million debt, PER 1791 fiscal reports. This funding, approved in April, was meant to equip 2,000 soldiers with muskets, tents, and provisions for a 6-month campaign. The plan called for a disciplined force to overwhelm the native confederation, estimated at 1,400 warriors by territorial scouts. Congressmen, like Virginia's James Madison, spoke of a glorious triumph to secure the frontier, per congressional debates. Yet, beneath this optimism lay a fatal flaw. The funds, meant to ensure victory, were entrusted to a man whose greed would unravel the expedition. Secretary of War Henry Knox, tasked with overseeing the campaign, made a catastrophic decision. He entrusted the funds to William Dewar, a New York financier with a reputation for speculative ventures. Dewar, who had amassed a fortune during the Revolution supplying army contracts, promised to secure supplies efficiently. Instead, he diverted over $100,000 into real estate schemes, purchasing 1.5 million acres in the Ohio Valley, according to court records from his 1792 bankruptcy. This misallocation left the expedition with only $180,000 for troops and equipment, per Treasury audits. A historian might remark, with biting sarcasm, that Dewar's pursuit of land enriched his coffers while starving the army he was meant to support. The consequences of Dewar's actions fell to Samuel Hodgson, the Army's quartermaster. Tasked with procuring supplies, Hodgson faced a slashed budget and resorted to the cheapest vendors. By June 1791, he had purchased 2,000 tents, but 1,400 leaked in rain, per soldiers' complaints recorded in Fort Washington logs. Axes, essential for clearing paths, numbered 1,000 but had blades that bent after 10 swings. Worst of all, the gunpowder, sourced from a dubious Philadelphia supplier, was defective. Tests showed 30% of musket rounds failed to fire, according to ordnance reports. Hodgson, aware of these shortcomings, reported them to Knox, who dismissed the concerns as minor, per correspondence cited in Wabash 1791. This negligence, as historian Richard White notes in the Middle Ground, ensured that St. Clair's men marched with tools unfit for war. As St. Clair prepared his expedition, the seeds of disaster were sown. His health faltered, his rival Wayne sat sidelined, and his supplies crumbled under scrutiny. Dewar's greed and Hodgson's failures, cloaked in bureaucratic indifference, left the army vulnerable. By July 1791, St. Clair rallied his 2,000 men at Fort Washington, unaware that the equipment meant to sustain them would betray them. The march to Kekionga loomed, and with it, a confrontation that would expose the fragility of a nation's ambitions and the resilience of those who stood in its path. By July 1791, Arthur St. Clair's army, mustered at Fort Washington in Cincinnati, embarked on its fateful march toward Kekionga, the Miami stronghold. Numbering 2,000 men, the force brimmed with determination to avenge Josiah Harmar's defeat, yet they remained blissfully ignorant of the supply failures orchestrated by William Dewar and Samuel Hodgson. The soldiers, a mix of 600 regulars, 1,200 militia, and 200 civilian camp followers, carried muskets and dreams of glory. But their equipment, as historian John F. Winkler details in Wabash 1791, was a litany of defects. 1,400 of 2,000 tents leaked, 800 of 1,500 muskets jammed, and 30% of their gunpowder fizzled in tests. St. Clair, trusting his quartermaster's assurances, led his men into the wilderness, unaware that their tools of war were already betraying them. Congress, in a burst of strategic ambition, burdened St. Clair with an additional task: construct 3 forts along the route to secure supply lines and assert American presence. These forts, Hamilton, St. Clair, and Jefferson, were to be built in the dense Ohio wilderness, where oak forests and tangled underbrush slowed progress to a crawl. By September, Fort Hamilton's construction consumed 20,000 man-hours, with 1,500 logs felled, per engineer reports. Fort St. Clair required 15,000 more, delaying the Army's advance by 6 weeks. This mandate, historian Colin G. Calloway argues in The Victory with No Name, was a bureaucratic folly that sapped St. Clair's momentum and exposed his men to autumn rains. A wry observer might note that Congress, safe in Philadelphia, built castles in the air while St. Clair's men toiled in mud. By early November, St. Clair's army reached the Wabash River, but their position was disastrously off course. Navigational errors, compounded by faulty maps and inexperienced scouts, left them 55 miles south of their intended path to Kekionga. Major Ebenezer Denny, St. Clair's aide, recorded in his diary that our compasses failed in the thick woods, leading the army to a narrow valley flanked by ravines. This blunder placed them in terrain ideal for ambushes, with no clear route to retreat. Historian Gregory Dowd, in A Spirited Resistance, calls this misstep a catastrophic failure of reconnaissance, noting that St. Clair's scouts covered only 3 miles daily, missing signs of native activity. The army, now isolated, faced an enemy they could neither see nor predict. Snow fell heavily as November began, blanketing the Wabash Valley in 6 inches of powder, per soldiers' accounts. St. Clair had planned to graze 300 cattle and 150 horses on open grasslands, but the frost killed the sparse vegetation. Within a week, 120 cattle and 80 horses perished, leaving the army with only 4 days' worth of meat, according to quartermaster logs. The loss crippled their mobility and morale, as soldiers faced the prospect of starvation 100 miles from Fort Washington. A historian might evoke the grim scene, men shivering in threadbare coats, their breath visible in the icy air, cursing the planners who sent them into winter with summer supplies. St. Clair's force, now reduced to 1,700 due to 300 desertions and illnesses, included 100 dragoons, cavalry trained for open-field charges. But the Wabash's rugged, terrain-jagged rocks and fallen logs rendered their horses useless. Of the 100 mounts, 60 were too weak to carry riders, per veterinary reports, forcing dragoons to march on foot. This misallocation of resources, as historian Richard White notes in The Middle Ground, reflected St. Clair's stubborn adherence to European tactics unsuited for frontier warfare. The dragoons, once a symbol of military might, became a liability, their sabers glinting impotently in the snow. The army's artillery, comprising 6 cannons, 3 6-pounders and 3 3-pounders, was meant to dominate the battlefield. Each 6-pounder could fire a 6-pound iron ball 1,200 yards, but their 800-pound carriages sank in the muddy trails, slowing the march to 5 miles daily. Worse, the cannons were positioned on exposed ground, with only 50 gunners to operate them, per ordnance records. Native sharpshooters, as later events would prove, could easily target these lumbering behemoths. Historian John Grenier, in The First Way of War, calls the artillery a false hope, noting that St. Clair failed to adapt to the fluid, cover-based tactics of his native foes. Morale among the troops plummeted as hardships mounted. Soldiers wore coats designed for summer, with 1,200 lacking wool linings, per supply manifests. Rations dwindled to 8 ounces of flour and 4 ounces of beef daily, half the standard for active duty, according to Army regulations. Sickness spread, with 150 men suffering from dysentery by the 1st of November, weakening the ranks further. Militia, who comprised 70% of the force, grumbled openly, with 200 threatening mutiny. Per Milliampere Jourdain's journal, St. Clair, hobbled by gout, struggled to inspire confidence, his orders delivered from a litter. A historian might paint this scene with a touch of dread. A dispirited army, ragged and hungry, camped in a frozen valley, their dreams of victory fading with each passing night. St. Clair's gravest error was his ignorance of the native coalition's strength. The Confederation, led by Little Turtle and Blue Jacket, numbered 1,400 warriors, per British agent reports. Yet St. Clair estimated only 500 based on outdated intelligence. His scouts, limited to a 3-mile radius, failed to detect the coalition's movements, leaving the army blind to the gathering storm. On the 3rd of November, sentries reported shadows in the trees, but St. Clair dismissed them as deer, per Lieutenant Colonel William Darke's testimony. This oversight, as historian Richard Cohn argues in Eagle and Sword, was a fatal lapse that left the army unprepared for the onslaught to come. As the men bedded down on the Wabash, their campfires flickering against the snow, they stood on the precipice of a disaster born of hubris and neglect. By the autumn of 1791, a formidable native confederation had coalesced in the Northwest Territory, poised to confront Arthur St. Clair's advancing army. Led by the Miami chief Little Turtle and the Shawnee warrior Blue Jacket, this coalition mustered 1,400 warriors, a force unprecedented in its scale and resolve. British intelligence reports from Detroit, cited in John F. Winkler's Wabash 1791, estimated that the Confederation drew from 40 villages, with each warrior representing a family determined to protect their ancestral lands. This alliance, forged in the crucible of American encroachment, stood as a testament to native resilience. uniting disparate tribes in a common cause. As historian Colin G. Calloway notes in The Victory with No Name, the Confederation's strength lay not merely in numbers, but in its shared vision of sovereignty, a defiance that would soon shake the young United States. The coalition comprised 5 major tribes: the Miami, Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandot, and Mingo. The Miami, numbering 600 warriors, anchored the alliance, their villages along the Maumee River serving as strategic hubs. The Shawnee, with 400 fighters, brought fierce combat experience, having clashed with American settlers since the 1770s. The Delaware and Wyandot, each contributing 200 warriors, added seasoned hunters skilled in forest warfare, while the Mingo, a 100-strong Iroquoian group, lent their expertise in scouting. These tribes, once rivals, were united by the loss of over 1,000 square miles of hunting grounds to settlers between 1783 and 1790 per treaty records. Historian Gregory Dowd, in A Spirited Resistance, argues that this unity was a diplomatic triumph, born of shared grievances against broken treaties and relentless expansion. British agents, operating from Fort Detroit, played a pivotal role in arming the Confederation. In 1791, they supplied 1,200 muskets, 2,000 pounds of gunpowder, and 800 steel hatchets, according to trade ledgers cited in The Middle Ground by Richard White. Each musket, a flintlock capable of firing 3 rounds per minute, gave native warriors parity with American soldiers. The hatchets, designed for close combat, doubled as tools for building fortifications. British officers, like Major John Smith, met with Little Turtle in August 1791, promising further aid if the Confederation halted American advances, per diplomatic correspondence. This support, while opportunistic, empowered the tribes to wage a sophisticated campaign, blending traditional tactics with European weaponry. Little Turtle, the Miami chief, emerged as the coalition's tactical genius. At 40, he commanded respect for his victories against settlers and militias, including the rout of Josiah Harmar's 1,400-man force in 1790, where 183 Americans fell. His strategy, detailed in Wabash 1791, emphasized mobility. Warriors moved in small, fluid groups, striking from cover and retreating before counterattacks. Little Turtle trained his men to exploit the forest's natural defenses, using ravines and fallen logs as shields. In drills, 200 Miami warriors could reposition across a mile of woodland in 10 minutes, per scout reports. Historian John Grenier, in The First Way of War, praises Little Turtle's mastery of asymmetric warfare, which maximized the Confederation's strengths against a larger, less agile foe. Blue Jacket, the Shawnee leader, complemented Little Turtle's brilliance with his own martial prowess. At 45, he had fought in the American Revolution, leading 150 Shawnee against Virginia militias in 1778 per tribal oral histories. His leadership galvanized the Shawnee, who suffered the loss of 12 villages to settler raids between 1786 and 1790, according to territorial records. Blue Jacket's warriors, armed with 400 British muskets, were adept at sustained volleys, capable of firing 1,200 rounds in a 5-minute engagement. His charisma, noted by British agent Alexander McKee, rallied younger warriors, with 300 Shawnee pledging loyalty by September 1791. Historian Richard Cohn, in Eagle and Sword, credits Blue Jacket with forging a fighting spirit that unified the coalition's diverse factions. The Confederation's size and coordination marked a historic milestone. Previous native resistances, like Pontiac's rebellion in 1763, had mustered 800 warriors at their peak, per British military estimates. The 1,400-strong coalition of 1791 dwarfed these efforts, representing 20% of the region's adult male native population, according to demographic studies in the Shawnees and the War for America, by Colin G. Calloway. Monthly councils, hosted in Miami villages, ensured strategic alignment, with 50 leaders debating targets and tactics. This coordination, as historian Richard White observes, transformed the Confederation into a military machine, capable of challenging the U.S. Army on equal terms. As St. Clair's army trudged toward the Wabash, the Confederation prepared for a decisive strike. By October 1791, 1,000 warriors had gathered near the Maumee River, with 400 more joining by the 1st of November, per British scout reports. They tracked St. Clair's 1,700-man force, noting its slow progress 5 miles daily through muddy trails. Little Turtle and Blue Jacket, meeting on the 30th of October, planned a dawn assault to exploit the Americans' exposed camp, according to oral accounts preserved by the Miami tribe. Their warriors, carrying 3 days' rations and 50 rounds of ammunition each, moved silently through the forest, their steps muffled by fallen leaves. A historian might evoke the tension, a silent army, eyes fixed on the American fires, awaiting the moment to unleash their fury. On the 3rd of November, native scouts, 50 in number, probed the edges of St. Clair's camp along the Wabash. Moving under moonlight, they counted 1,700 American troops and 6 cannons, noting the absence of pickets beyond a 100-yard perimeter. PER survivor testimonies in Wabash, 1791. These scouts, undetected by St. Clair's sentries, reported back by midnight, confirming the camp's vulnerability. Little Turtle, with a strategist's precision, positioned 1,400 warriors in a crescent formation, encircling the Americans across a 2-mile front. As the night deepened, the Confederation stood ready, their muskets primed and hatchets sharpened, poised to deliver a blow that would echo through history. On the night of the 3rd of November, 1791, the American camp along the Wabash River lay steeped in a deceptive calm, its 1,700 soldiers unaware of the peril closing in. General Richard Butler, St. Clair's second-in-command, bore the critical task of securing the perimeter. Yet, in a staggering lapse, Butler failed to deploy pickets, the sentries who would patrol beyond the camp's 100-yard radius to detect enemy movements. Standard Army protocol, as outlined in 1791 regulations, required 50 pickets to cover a 2-mile perimeter for a force of this size. Butler, a Revolutionary War veteran who had led 1,000 troops at Yorktown, assigned only 20 sentries, all stationed within 50 yards of the camp, per Milliampere Jor Ebenezer Denny's journal. Historian John F. Winkler in Wabash 1791 calls this omission a dereliction of duty, noting that Butler's negligence left the army blind to the gathering native coalition. Worse still, Butler ignored reports of native scouts prowling the camp's edges. At dusk, 10 American sentries spotted figures moving in the trees, 200 yards out, according to Lieutenant Colonel William Dark's testimony. These were 50 native scouts, sent by Little Turtle to probe defenses, but Butler dismissed the sightings as wild animals, failing to relay them to St. Clair. This decision, as historian Colin G. Calloway notes in The Victory with No Name, was a fatal blunder that robbed the army of precious hours to prepare. Butler's silence, perhaps born of overconfidence after surviving 12 revolutionary battles, ensured the camp remained oblivious to the 1,400 warriors massing nearby. A historian might remark, with a grim edge, that Butler's inaction turned the Wabash into a trap of his own making. Arthur St. Clair, unaware of the enemy's proximity, issued routine orders for the 4th of November. Confined to his tent by gout, he directed his men to clean muskets and prepare for a morning march, believing the native coalition was still 20 miles away at Kekionga. His intelligence, based on a scout report from the 28th of October, estimated only 500 warriors, a gross undercount of the 1,400-strong force now encircling him, per British agent records. St. Clair's orders included no defensive measures beyond a 50-man guard at the camp's center, leaving 1,650 soldiers and civilians exposed. Historian Gregory Dowd, in A Spirited Resistance, argues that St. Clair's reliance on outdated information courted disaster, reflecting a broader failure to adapt to the fluid nature of native warfare. The American camp, sprawled across a 300-yard clearing along the Wabash, was a study in vulnerability. Its 1,400 leaky tents, pitched on uneven ground, offered no protection against attack. No trenches or palisades fortified the perimeter, despite Army manuals recommending 3-foot earthworks for frontier camps. The camp's layout, with 600 militia on the northern edge and 600 regulars to the south, was split by a 50-yard gap, per engineer reports, inviting an enemy to divide the force. 6 cannons, positioned on open ground, lacked cover, their 50 gunners exposed to sharpshooters. Historian Richard White, in The Middle Ground, calls the camp a sitting target. Its poor fortifications a testament to St. Clair's misjudgment of the coalition's capabilities. The soldiers, exhausted from a 100-mile march through mud and snow, slept fitfully under flimsy canvas. By the 3rd of November, 1,200 men wore tattered coats, 800 lacked blankets, and 150 suffered from dysentery, per quartermaster logs. Rations had dwindled to 6 ounces of flour and 3 ounces of beef daily, half the required 12 ounces, leaving men weak and irritable. Militia, comprising 70% of the force, whispered of desertion, with 30 slipping away that night, per milliampere Jor Denny's records. The camp's 200 civilian followers, women, children, and teamsters shuttled in 50 wagons, their presence a logistical burden. A historian might evoke the scene with somber weight, a weary army shivering in the dark, their flickering campfires a beacon to the unseen enemy. Under cover of darkness, the native coalition, led by Little Turtle and Blue Jacket, executed their plan with chilling precision. By 10 p.m., 1,400 warriors, 600 Miami, 400 Shawnee, 200 Delaware, 200 Wyandotte, and 100 Mingo encircled the camp, forming a crescent-shaped line across a 2-mile front. Each warrior carried a British musket, 50 rounds of ammunition, and a hatchet, per scout reports preserved in Wabash 1791. Moving silently through snow-dusted woods, they used ravines and fallen logs for cover, their positions 100 yards from the American sentries. Little Turtle's strategy, as historian John Grenier notes in The First Way of War, relied on overwhelming surprise, exploiting the camp's disarray to maximize impact. The coalition's plan was meticulously crafted. At a council on the 2nd of November, Little Turtle and Blue Jacket outlined a dawn assault to strike the militia first, knowing their 600 men were the least disciplined, per mile Amy oral histories. The crescent formation, 400 yards deep, would envelop the camp, with 500 warriors targeting the northern flank, 500 the southern, and 400 holding the center to prevent escape. The attack, set for 6 a.m., aimed to sow panic, forcing the Americans into a chaotic retreat. British agent Alexander McKee, observing preparations, reported 1,200 muskets primed by midnight, signaling the coalition's readiness. Historian Richard Cohn, in Eagle and Sword, praises the plan's surgical clarity, a stark contrast to St. Clair's complacency. By midnight, the stage was set for a catastrophic confrontation. The native warriors, their faces painted with red and black ochre, waited in silence, their breath visible in the frigid air. Across the clearing, the American camp slumbered, its 20 sentries oblivious to the 1,400 pairs of eyes watching from the darkness. The Wabash, its waters glinting under a waning moon, bore witness to a moment of eerie stillness, the calm before a storm that would shatter lives and ambitions. As the hours ticked toward dawn, the coalition's resolve hardened, their muskets steady, ready to unleash a fury that would redefine the frontier's history. As dawn broke on the 4th of November, 1791, the Wabash River Valley erupted in chaos. At 6 a.m., 1,400 native warriors, led by Little Turtle and Blue Jacket, charged from the snow-dusted woods, their war cries piercing the morning silence. The coalition's 600 Miami, 400 Shawnee, 200 Delaware, 200 Wyandot, and 100 Ming unleashed a torrent of musket fire, with 1,200 flintlocks discharging 600 rounds in the first 10 minutes, per British observer estimates. The crescent-shaped assault, spanning a 2-mile front, targeted the American camp's northern flank, where 600 militia stood. Historian John F. Winkler, in Wabash 1791, describes the attack as a thunderbolt, its speed and ferocity shattering the Americans' fragile defenses. The warriors, armed with British muskets and hatchets, moved with lethal precision, their advance a testament to months of planning. The militia, caught off guard, collapsed within minutes. Stationed on the camp's exposed northern edge, the 600 volunteers, many farmers with only 2 weeks' training, faced the brunt of the assault. Of their 600 muskets, 200 jammed due to defective gunpowder per ordnance reports, leaving them defenseless. Panic swept through their ranks as 150 fell in the first volley, according to Major Ebenezer Denny's journal. The survivors fled south, crashing into the lines of 600 regular soldiers. This retreat, as historian Colin G. Calloway notes in The Victory with No Name, sowed disarray, turning the camp into a churning mass of fear and confusion. A historian might evoke the terror, men stumbling over roots, their shouts drowned by the coalition's relentless cries. The regular soldiers, disciplined veterans of the Revolution, held their ground briefly. Positioned 50 yards behind the militia, they formed ranks and fired volleys, killing 20 native warriors in the first 15 minutes, per survivor accounts. But the coalition's cover-based tactics firing from behind trees and ravines proved unstoppable. Each warrior, carrying 50 rounds, maintained a steady barrage, with 500 Shawnee and Miami fighters targeting the regulars' flanks. By 6:30 a.m., 200 regulars had fallen, and their lines buckled under the weight of 800 musket rounds per minute, per battle reconstructions in the First Wave of War by John Grenier. The soldiers, unable to see their foes, broke ranks, their cohesion crumbling as the crescent tightened. Native warriors, their faces painted with red and black ochre, exploited the terrain with devastating effect. Moving in groups of 20, they darted between oaks and fallen logs, targeting the camp's 50 artillery gunners. The Miami, under Little Turtle's command, prioritized the 6 cannons, 3 6-pounders and 3 3-pounders, positioned on open ground. By 6:45 a.m., 30 gunners lay dead, picked off by 100 Wyandot sharpshooters stationed 150 yards away, per Lieutenant Colonel William Dark's report. Historian Richard White, in The Middle Ground, praises the warriors' surgical accuracy, noting their ability to neutralize the cannons that could have turned the tide. The artillery, meant to dominate, became a liability, its crews exposed and helpless. The 6-pounders, each capable of firing a 6-pound ball 1,200 yards, were silenced by 7 a.m. The 3-pounders, lighter but still lethal, managed only 10 rounds before their 20 gunners fell, per ordnance logs. Native sharpshooters, using British muskets with a 100-yard effective range, fired from cover, rendering the cannons useless. The loss of artillery, as historian Gregory Dowd argues in A Spirited Resistance, stripped the Americans of their last advantage, leaving them vulnerable to the coalition's relentless advance. A grim irony emerges. St. Clair's prized cannons, hauled 100 miles through mud, served only as targets for the warriors' precision. Chaos engulfed the camp as fleeing soldiers trampled 1,400 tents and 200 supply crates. The militia's retreat had sparked a rout, with 400 men abandoning their muskets, per quartermaster records. Tents collapsed under the stampede, and 50 wagons, loaded with 1,000 pounds of flour, were overturned. The camp's 50-yard gap between militia and regulars became a choke point, where 100 soldiers were crushed or suffocated, according to Major Denny's account. The coalition exploited this disorder, with 200 Delaware warriors firing into the crowded center, killing 50 men in 5 minutes. Historian Richard Cohn, in Eagle and Sword, calls the scene a maelstrom, where panic fueled the coalition's dominance. A desperate bayonet charge, ordered by St. Clair at 7:15 a.m., aimed to break the native line. Major John Hamtramck led 200 regulars in a thrust against the Miami flank, bayonets fixed. The warriors, true to Little Turtle's tactics, dispersed into the woods, avoiding the charge. Within 10 minutes, they reformed 100 yards back, resuming their musket fire with 600 rounds, killing 80 of Hamtramck's men, per battle reports. The failure, as Winkler notes, exposed the futility of European tactics against the coalition's fluid strategy. The warriors' discipline, retreating only to strike again, left the Americans reeling, their courage no match for the terrain's unforgiving reality. Arthur St. Clair, hobbled by gout, struggled to rally his men. At 54, he could barely walk, relying on aides to prop him up outside his tent. Unable to don his uniform, he shouted orders in a nightshirt, his voice lost in the din of 2,000 musket shots per minute. Of his 1,700 men, 500 were dead or wounded by 8 a.m. per Denny's tally. St. Clair, who had survived 12 revolutionary battles, faced a slaughter unlike any before, with 300 militia deserting their posts. Historian Calloway describes him as a general adrift, his leadership eroded by pain and chaos. A poignant detail emerges. St. Clair's horse was shot dead beneath him, one of 80 mounts lost, symbolizing the collapse of his command. Approximately 200 non-combatants, 100 women, 60 children, and 40 teamsters were caught in the carnage. Camped in 50 wagons at the rear, they faced the coalition's southern flank, where 200 Shawnee warriors fired 400 rounds, killing 120 civilians in 20 minutes, per survivor letters. The women, many wives of soldiers, and children, as young as 5, had no weapons or cover. Their deaths, as White notes, underscored the battle's indiscriminate brutality, a tragedy born of the Army's decision to bring families into a war zone. A historian might pause, with somber weight, to honor these forgotten victims, whose presence reflected the era's harsh realities. At 8:30 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel William Dark led a final bayonet charge to break the encirclement. With 200 regulars, he targeted a 100-yard gap in the Wyandotte line, killing 10 warriors and forcing a temporary retreat, per Darkey's report. This breach allowed 500 survivors to flee south, though 100 fell to pursuing Mingo sharpshooters. Darkey's charge, costing 60 of his men, was the Army's last act of defiance. Historian Grenier calls it a flicker of courage amid collapse, enabling a remnant to escape the coalition's tightening noose. The warriors, focused on the camp, did not fully pursue their attention drawn to 200 looted wagons. The survivors, now 400, fled 30 miles toward Fort Washington, pursued by 200 native warriors. Over 12 hours, 300 stragglers were killed or captured, their discarded muskets 500 in total littering the trail, per quartermaster logs. The coalition, satisfied with their victory, halted at dusk to plunder 1,000 pounds of flour and 200 gallons of whiskey. By 9 a.m., the battle ended, lasting 3 hours. Of 1,700 Americans, 623 soldiers and 200 civilians were killed, 258 wounded, and only 32 reached Fort Washington unscathed, per congressional reports. Native losses, per British estimates, were 21 killed, a stark contrast. Winkler calls the battle a massacre, its toll a grim monument to American hubris and native resolve. The Native coalition's victory, though decisive, comes at a minimal cost, fewer than 50 warriors lost, per historical estimates. The Americans leave a trail of discarded weapons, which the warriors loot, pausing their pursuit to seize food and whiskey. Congress launches its first investigation into the executive branch, exposing Dewar's financial debacle and Hodgdon's failures, yet both retain their posts. St. Clair is cleared of blame, a decision debated by historians for its leniency. Washington, undeterred, appoints Anthony Wayne, who secures victory at Fallen Timbers in 1794, paving the way for the Treaty of Greenville, 1795. This treaty opens the Northwest Territory to settlers, displacing native tribes further. The battle's legacy underscores the U.S. Army's early fragility and the Native Confederation's resilience, a testament to their defense of ancestral lands against overwhelming odds. As the dust settled on the Wabash, the Native coalition's triumph stood as a fleeting yet powerful assertion of sovereignty. Their victory, born of unity and ingenuity, delayed the tide of American expansion, if only briefly. With empathy, we honor the Miami, Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandot, and Mingo warriors who fought not for conquest but for survival. Yet, the question lingers: how might history have shifted if the U.S. had sought diplomacy over dominance in those formative years? Reflect on this as we ponder the cost of a nation's birth and the resilience of those who stood their ground.